right. Welcome, fifth grade readers, families, friends, anyone joining along here. Chapter 10. Let's see what was going on when we last left here. Oh, yeah, I remember now. They were climbing, trying to get from Uncle Nate's house to Seth's parents' house, the rental right by the water. And along the way, it was pretty horrific, if I remember. Yeah, there was the young lady and her daughter who got swept away. Let's see here. Seth was having a lot of flashbacks, thinking like, man, why, I miss Kate and her sticky fingers around my neck. And as they're going down along, they were, the wind was throwing all kinds of building pieces at them, and it was a very dangerous place to be out on the street. So let's see what happens here. Josiah stumbled, and I hooked a drenched arm through his. He grabbed it, and we leaned into each other, pushing hard through the wind and rising water. Slate and shattered lumber hit all around us. Submerged objects struck my legs, sharp and piercing 1 minute, fleshy and stomach-churning the next. Yuck. Then, gratefully, I'd feel them slide away, caught up in the current again. He's experiencing bodies of the dead bumping into him. He can't see them, but he can feel them. During a short lull, I stopped to get my bearings, squinting through the rain, and at last hope pounded in my chest. "Look!" I shouted. "There!" Josiah pulled hard at my arm, dragging me toward the house. We struggled past the fence, across the yard, and took the stairs up and out of the water. My legs felt like tree stumps, and when I closed the door behind us, my ears rang. "Mama! Papa!" I yelled. I stumbled from room to room, but found no one. Nothing, till I saw a note tacked to my bedroom door. I tore it off and read Papa's hurried scrawl out loud to Josiah. "Seth, gone the Nates. Hope to find you safe there. If not, trust you will seek sturdier shelter with peaks or vetters. God be with you, Papa." So, Seth and Josiah trudged all the way through to see if they could help them, only to find they're not there. I stared at the note, picturing Mama, Papa, and the kids with slate flying around their heads and debris washing down flooded streets toward them like freight trains. Had I passed them out there and not realized it? The woman swept away. I hadn't seen her face. The child. Was the hair dark? Was it Kate? I closed my eyes until the sick wave of fear eased. Still shaky, knees weak, I walked back through the house. Dinner sat on the table, uneaten. A cake with a pitcher of boiled custard waited on the stove. Matt's baseball lay in the seat of a chair, and beside it, a small handful of wilted jasmine. Kate's funeral flowers. Yeah, remember that odd time when they were playing dead? And I said maybe it's foreshadowing? I picked up the brown blossoms, stuffed them in one pocket, and poked the ball in the other. Then I noticed that my pants were torn and my leg oozed blood. I looked at Josiah, at all the scrapes and cuts. We'd had a rough time of it, but we'd made it. "So they's with Mr. Braden?" he asked. "I hope so," I said, staring at the note. "So we needs to get to the Vetters." I shook my head. Aunt Julia said the Peaks have a real sturdy house. Might be better there. Josiah cocked his head and looked at me. "My bones is saying Vetters." I gave him a surprised look, and he laughed at me easy like. His eyes full of something warm I'd only sensed before. I felt it sifting through me, easing my aches and worry. "Okay," I said finally, grinning at him. "The Vetters it is, then." We turned, headed for the door, when the window exploded. I ducked, covering my head while glass shot past Josiah, clear across the house. He caught a piece in his forehead, and blood streamed down his face and into his eyes. I pulled the 3-inch sliver from his skin, ripped a kitchen towel lengthwise, and tied it around his head. Wind whipped through the open window, pummeling the walls and ceilings till cracks raced around the plaster. Let's go out. Let's get out of here before the roof goes, I shouted. He nodded, and we scrambled down the stairs, back into the water and howling wind. We must have looked like drowned rats when the Vedders opened the door to us, but they were a sight too. Dressed in woolen bathing suits, Mrs. Vedder insisted we have some warm broth, and I gratefully accepted. Collapsing into a ladder-back chair at the kitchen table, Josiah hesitated, his hands poked deep inside his wet pockets, till Mr. Vedder pulled out a chair for him, too. Sit down, Josiah. At times like these, we can't stand on ceremony. Josiah nodded and mumbled, Yes, sir, thank you, sir. The house shuddered in the wind, and while we downed our bowls of broth, Mr. Vedder talked to us about the storm. This house isn't as well built as the Richard Peak house, he said. I figure if it starts to break up, we'll make a human chain, and you boys can follow us down the fence line to the peaks. I nodded and glanced at Josiah, wondering if his bones had anything to say about that. 5-year-old Catherine tugged at my shirt sleeve. Where's Kate? She asked. Didn't she come with you? I shook my head. She's with her mama and papa. Are they home? No. They're all safe and sound at my uncle's house. I said, praying it was so. Well, I sure wish she was here. No one will play with me. Not Jacob or Alan, not even Lola. They all say I'm too little. She wandered off, and I turned my attention back to the storm. The Vedder house had been tightly shuttered, but through a broken slat, I could see all the way to the swollen gulf. It was a staggering sight. Home after home, looking like tiny islands surrounded by angry sea. Like they'd been built in the middle of an ocean. The ones closest to the gulf were gone, splintered and swept away or slammed against others, waiting for the next wave. Farther out, a big gray wall of water, like an army of elephants, moved slow and sure toward the island. It was held somewhat at bay by the northeast wind, but I couldn't help but wonder what it would mean to all of us if the wind shifted to the south. I blinked the sick thought away and kept an eye on the water in the yard. It soon swamped the 4-foot fence, and I knew it was just a matter of time before waves broke up the closest row of houses and sent them slamming into us. The house began to fill with people, some whose homes were had already come apart, and some who feared theirs would soon follow. Mr. and Mrs. Mason came with their children, along with a number of soldiers from Fort Crockett, till there must have been 50 of us gathered in the front hall. Josiah and one of the soldiers, Private Orville Billings, helped Mr. Vedder remove closet doors. Then we all helped nail them crosswise to reinforce the windows and front entry. The storm roared and buffeted the house. The women sat on the stairs, taking care not to show their fear to the children. Catherine, content at last to have playmates, sat under the staircase, sharing her new gray kitten with Francesca and Kearney Jr. Josiah and I had just settled on the floor near the kids when I felt a movement. My vision blurred, and a wave of queasiness hit me. He's motion sick like I am, it sounds. Out of the corner of my eye, a small table slid a few feet across the floor. I stared at it, confused. For a moment, then felt the whole house rise and rock like a ship at sea. Shocked cries sounded all around me. We were afloat. Now keep in mind, there's 50 people in a house, and this house has just left its foundation and is now floating like a boat. Timbers groaned and cracked as the house washed off its 6-foot foundation. Seconds later, we hit the ground with a jaw-shattering jolt. My ears popped, and water gushed into the house so fast I didn't have time to get to my feet. I kicked and groped my way to the surface. grabbing for Josiah to make sure he would make it too, but he was already up, fishing Kearney Jr. from the murky water. I grappled for Francesca and handed her, dripping, to her panicky mother, who had been forced to flee farther up the stairs. Lola and Alan popped up, then Jacob, his bathing suit nearly ripped off him. Private Billings pulled Catherine out, sputtering and crying, "Papa, Papa!" Mr. Vedder took her on his back, but the water quickly rose again. I pulled her from him and set her on the stairs, only to hear her cry once more, this time for her kitten. Mr. Vedder pulled the soaked and clawing fur ball from the water and tossed it onto the stairs. Mrs. Mason caught unawares, jumped shrieking, "Rat!" and slung it back. There must have been a dozen of us men, all up to our necks in cold, dark water, scrambling to save the shivering gray kitten once again. So it wasn't a rat. She just freaked out and threw the cat back in. Dark closed over us, and still the house shook with each violent burst of wind. Waves crashed through broken windows. Huge beams from the newly constructed barracks at Fort Crockett thudded against the walls. We helped Mr. Vedder re-nail the closet doors, loosened by the settling of the house, then stood with arms stretched through the cracks where the front door had once been, pushing away beams and timbers during each lull. Others stood near windows, doing the same, fighting to keep the house from being battered into kindling. A sound, loud as a freight train, roared over our heads. I heard a great cracking and splintering, and when it stopped, the house listed to the north and rain poured down the stairs. Mrs. Vedder checked and reported back. "The roof over the 2 east bedrooms is gone," she said with surprising calm. She moved the women and children farther up the flooded stairs and finally into the bedroom. I stayed behind with Josiah, helping Mr. Vedder ward off the battering rams till the water rose so high we had to give up. Our arms were torn, full of splinters and glass, but none were hurt as bad as poor Mr. Vedder. We took him to the bathroom, where maybe 15 people had gathered, mostly women and children. Faces turned to us, and candlelight flickered in eyes. They were empty of everything but fear. The smaller children lay in the big white tub, bundled in bedspreads, urged to sleep. Jacob, his ripped bathing suit, discarded on the floor, didn't look too happy about having to wear Lola's petticoat. A petticoat is a type of underwear for women would wear back then. And I shut the door, leaving Mrs. Vedder to wrap her husband's arms and hands with what was left of the clean toweling, and sat in the dark hall with Josiah and the rest of the men. No one spoke. We shivered from the cold and rocked with each explosive blast of wind and water. But it was the eerie lulls that finally made me cover my ears. A lull is when it quiets down a little bit, and that was scaring him most. In brief, crystal seconds, I heard the crunching of houses breaking apart, the terrified bawling of animals, the faraway cries of people praying and pleading for help. I thought of Mama, Papa, and the kids, which quickly brought me back to the woman I'd seen just hours ago, whisked down the flooded alley, clinging to her child. A choking ache washed over me, filling my eyes and knotting my throat. Oh, heaven, please help them, and me as well, for in my selfishness I continued to pray that the woman and child hadn't been Mama and Kate. Whoosh. The storm is getting worse and worse. We'll see what chapter 12 holds.